Yeah, I'm pretty sure though we will finish Daniel chapter 11 this evening, and yes, we're going to pick up with verse 36. Then we'll tackle chapter 12 on Wednesday. Chapter 12 is fairly short, so I'm pretty sure that, thank you, that we will be able to finish chapter 12 on Wednesday, and then after that, we got a couple of other short passages to look at, and then we'll pick up back in Revelation. And by the way, my goal this evening is not chapter 11, but through verse 4 of chapter 12, if we get that far. Now, what we have seen so far in chapter 11 was a description of the various battles and conflicts that gave rise to Antiochus Epiphanes and his conquest of Israel in about the 2nd century BC. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was merely a model, or as you'll recall, a type of the Antichrist. Beginning in verse 36, and of course, it's interesting that Daniel, and this is not unusual for a lot of biblical writers, but Daniel gives us no hint at all that he's switching gears. And it may be that Daniel didn't know. Daniel is only relating the vision and the story that's being told to him. But there is a significant transition between the story that he winds up with verse 35 and then what he begins in verse 36. Because it is clear that beginning in verse 36, Daniel is no longer talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He is now talking about the actual Antichrist. He's gone from the model to the real thing. And we'll see why that is and how we can know that the last part of this chapter is indeed talking about the Antichrist as we'll go along. And I'll point those out to you because you may be wondering, well, how do you know that he's transitioned? It'll be obvious when we get there. All right, verse 36 says, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done." Of course, now this particular passage could go either way. It could be indicative of what Antiochus Epiphanes did, because Antiochus Epiphanes did the same thing. But we will see that the Antichrist, when he enters the temple and desecrates the Holy of Holies, which, as a reminder, when does that happen?
3.5 years into the tribulation.
Midpoint of the tribulation. That this is what he will do, that he will declare that he is God and will magnify himself above all other so-called gods. Verse 37, though, confirms for us that this is no longer Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 37 says, "And he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all." Now, Antiochus Epiphanes did demand that he be worshipped as God. However, the difference here is, as a Greek leader, Antiochus Epiphanes still worshipped the so-called Greek pantheon of gods. All of those, mythical gods that you probably studied about in high school or whatever. Antiochus Epiphanes believed in those. You'll notice here, it says that this king that Daniel is talking about here, says he shows no regard for any of the gods of his fathers. That did not include Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, while he was a murderous, monstering, leader, if you can call him that, he did still give homage to the Greek gods. The Antichrist will not. When he desecrates the temple, the Antichrist will claim that he is God and will claim that there are no other gods. Now, the second part of this, it says, or for the desire of women. There's two ways to translate this. And unfortunately, in the original Hebrew, there's no way to tell which Daniel included. Now, the obvious one, when it says for the desire of women, there's some that says, well, the Antichrist will probably be a homosexual. And that is one possibility. The other possibility, the way this reads in the original Hebrew, is that what this means is that the women around him, just like I'm sure we've all seen this, that when figures become very popular, that, well, I'll give you an example. How many of you remember when the Beatles became popular in the United States back in the 60s?
Beatlemania.
Oh, yeah. And every time they had a concert, what did all the young women do?
Swoon.
Well, that's kind of the other possible interpretation of this, is that he is going to be extremely popular with the women, but that he's basically like, I don't care. Have no interest in that. I'm focused on this over here. Both are possibilities based on the language. Now, based upon the direction that culture is going today, which of the two you think is probably the most likely interpretation?
Homosexual.
Probably. And I think that as the farther we go into the future, I think that becomes more and more a likelihood, is that whoever this is may very well basically just say, I'm not interested in women because that's just not my thing. And now we see this in our own country. Somebody comes out of the closet and says, I'm a homosexual. What is the culture doing with them now?
We're celebrating them.
Oh yeah, we're patting them on the back and saying, how proud of you. And I don't mean that in the pride sense. I mean, there was no pun intended there, although I guess we could make one. But we're patting them on the back and congratulating them, and we're celebrating, oh, he's a homosexual, or she's come out of the closet, or whatever. And we're saying how great that is.
Currently there's quite a few of them in Biden's cabinet already.
Mm-hmm. So I think that if we'd have asked this question 20 or 30 years ago, it might have been able to go either way. But I think, as you said, the farther the future marches on.
So I may be wrong about Alex Soros, huh?
How so?
He just got married. I was texting back and forth with my best friend the other day, and I happened to send a text and said, Alex Soros may well be the Antichrist. And he texted back and said, well, he did just marry a succubus.
Marry a what?
A succubus. He married Huma Abedin, if you know who she is.
No clue.
She's a former confidant of Hillary Clinton's close circle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yay.
She was married to
That pervert.
yeah.
Well, now
another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to sidetrack you there.
my
I'm good at that.
my son, he said that apparently, I looked it up, apparently this is a thing, but my son says that there are some homosexuals that will marry a woman, especially if they're public figures, that they'll get married just to, appear, legitimate.
Isn't that what Charlie Crist did?
I don't know. Is he a homosexual?
Well, go down.
Well, anyway, my son said that the culture calls them their beard. He says, well, if you refer to some woman as your beard, it's basically that's the woman that you married just for appearances, and that you really, not interested. Well, I'm not going to get into all that, but but anyway, that's all that possibility. But the most likelihood or likely interpretation of this, I think, is that there's a good possibility the Antichrist may be a homosexual, which again, Antiochus Epiphanes was not, as far as we know.
Pastor, I got a quick question.
Shoot.
Neither shall he regard to God, and it's capitalized, of his fathers. A lot of people point to that and tell you that he'll probably be Jewish.
Well, that's actually the next thing I was going to get into.
Okay.
All right. Nor will he show regard for any god, if he will magnify himself above them all. Now, actually in the original Hebrew, it just says for any god. Now, whether it's capitalized or not, that would be entirely an interpreter's decision.
It's not in my Bible.
Yeah, because keep in mind, whether it is or isn't, in the original Hebrew, there's no such thing as a capital letter.
Right.
Like in our language, we have capitals and little letters. Hebrew didn't. It just had letters. So you couldn't distinguish whether something was a proper noun or not by how it was written, because didn't know that. So again, if you see a capital letter, that's entirely the interpreter's choice.
Yep.
But what the original Hebrew says, it says no regard for any god, because what it's basically saying here is that when the Antichrist appears and it becomes apparent who he is, that unlike Antiochus Epiphanes, who did in fact still worship the Greek pantheon, the Antichrist won't worship anybody. He's going to say, I'm God. You worship me. When it would be very difficult to say that you are God if you yourself as God were going to worship somebody else. Well, the Antichrist basically is denying that there are any other gods, that he is God. So when it says that he will show regard for no other God, well, he's going to denounce any other form of worship. That's the third thing you want to see that's characteristic of this particular individual, is he is going to put an end to all other, worship. He won't be successful. There's still going to be worship of various types going on, but from what he is able to control and what he will be declaring, he will be there declaring and in the temple saying, I'm God, you worship me. And that's what it says, for he will magnify himself above all. Verse 38, but instead he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Now, what this is talking about is that the Antichrist is basically going, while he will assume control by, being a huckster, by tricks, by dirty tricks, by, politics, any way he can get in. Once he gets in control, well, what have we already seen is one of the, the first things that happens during the tribulation period. What about the breaking of the first couple of seals? Anybody remember? War. Well, what this is saying is that his God, and I, quotes like that as I'm describing it, when it says the God of fortresses, he's going to be or become a military leader. The only thing that's going to be important to him is war. And we've already seen that in our study so far of Revelation. First thing that happens when the Antichrist comes to power, war. And then, of course, famine, pestilence, all a result of war. Well, if there's one thing that will characterize the entire 7-year tribulation period, it's going to be one war after another. And the Antichrist will be the one running the show. So when it says he will serve a God of fortresses, it's talking about the military. Now it says a God whom his fathers did not know. Well, what that tells us is that whoever the Antichrist is going to be will not be from a military background. Again, that disproves that we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes here. Because what was Antiochus Epiphanes' background?
General.
He was general. Absolutely. And he was from a family of military people. Antichrist won't be. And it will say that, unlike even now when, while we honor the military, we don't exactly worship the concept of the military. In fact, Americans have traditionally kind of had a distrust of the military. Even for those of us in here who were part of that, it's just part of our culture. What's one of the first things that the military has done, or our government has done, after the end of every single war this country has seen?
Stand down the army.
There you go. Start booting people out. Send them back home. And we're not the only one. I mean, I'm using us as an example, but that's been characteristic of most 20th and 21st century nations. That nations abhor the concept of a standing army. I mean, there's been a few exceptions. China, Russia, but I think it's pretty obvious why countries of that sort are of a different mindset. But most so-called free countries, free nations, we don't like the military. Well, that's not going to characterize the Antichrist. He is going to come from a non-military background and then become a military leader, and everything from that point on is going to be one war after another. And notice it says he will honor with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Anybody want to take a wild guess what that is probably talking about? Keep in mind, in this context, we're talking about his God of fortresses.
He's going to pour everything he's got into building up his military.
You just hit it right on the nose. What is one of the biggest political complaints that our country has? Every time we develop a budget,
Military spending.
how much money we're spending on the Department of Defense. Well, the Antichrist is going to pour everything he's got into the military. Verse 39. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. Now there's a couple of possibilities. It says he will take action against the strongest of fortresses. There's two ways to look at that. A secular way and a spiritual way. Right now, secular way, you would be looking at, when you're talking about the fortress or the strongest of fortresses, who do you think in the world today has got the strongest military?
We do.
Maybe.
We still do.
We have been.
We still do.
China.
China.
We can still beat China.
The thing that China, though, would have going in their favor against us,
Quantity.
if we got into a war of attrition.
Quantity is a quality all into itself. It was paraphrasing Stalin there.
Yeah, but if we got into a war of attrition, China would whip our rear ends. Because they could outlast us. Down to the point that we're throwing nothing but rocks at each other, they'd still be coming at us. And that's one of the things we're going to see that actually will take place. And actually we're going to address that in this chapter before we're done. That's one possibility. Is when it says he's, how did it word this here? Take action against the strongest of fortresses. Some people say, well, this is an indication that one of his first targets is going to be countries like ours that have a strong military, assuming we're still even around then. That's a secular possibility. Now there's a spiritual possibility here, and that is that this is possibly a reference to coming against Jerusalem itself. There is a lot of evidence to indicate that when it talks about being the strongest of fortresses, that this might be a reference to Jerusalem, because ultimately, military might aside, what is the strongest of fortresses?
The house of God.
The house of God. So if he's speaking spiritually here, this is a reference to Jerusalem. Now, can we tell at this point which this means? It's still a flip of the coin. So, depends on how we look at it. Either way, it wouldn't be a good thing. Either he's going to start a war with countries like ours, Great Britain, NATO, or he's marching against Jerusalem. One way or the other, he is coming against Jerusalem, which we'll see shortly. It says, give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many and parcel out land for a price. Well, what happens when you've got a great political and military leader? And, well, we saw this again in World War II. How many countries allied with us that when the war was over, they all wanted their piece of the pie?
Germany.
Germany got parceled up. That's what this is saying, is that whoever allies themselves with the Antichrist as he's making war, they're all going to be in it to get their little piece of the pie. And that he's going to honor them by said, okay, we just defeated this particular country. Here, it's yours. Well, you've been loyal. Here, this part's yours. That's exactly what Daniel is saying is going to be going on here.
He's going to need governors.
He's going to need local governors because he can't do it all on his own. Unlike what he's telling people, the Antichrist is not a god. He does have limitations. By the way, this is one thing to keep in mind. Don't make this mistake in your interpretation of who and what the Antichrist is. The Antichrist is not Satan. The Antichrist is controlled by Satan. But the Antichrist himself is not Satan. He's going to be a person.
Is he human?
He's human. He will be a human who is definitely demon possessed, and Satan will be pulling his strings. Now, the reason we know that he is not Satan, for example, at the end of the tribulation period and Christ comes back, one of the things that we are told, we haven't gotten that far yet, so I'm giving you a little heads up. When Jesus comes back to set up his millennial kingdom, we are told that at that point, the false prophet and the Antichrist, again, this is the satanic trinity, the devil, the false prophet, and the Antichrist. 3 different individuals. False prophet and the Antichrist will be judged immediately at the second coming, and they will be cast into the lake of fire. Now we know for everybody else that rejects Christ, their judgment comes at the great white throne judgment, 1,000 years later. Jesus makes an exception for the false prophet and the Antichrist. We're told they're cast into the lake of fire just as soon as he comes back. However, what happens to the devil?
Put away for a little while.
He gets chained away for 1,000 years.
He gets chained away for 1,000 years and is let loose for a short period at the end of the millennial kingdom. That in itself tells you the Antichrist and the devil, 2 different individuals. Certainly the Antichrist is a tool of the devil and is controlled by Satan. But make no mistake, the Antichrist is not himself Satan. But he will probably, by no stretch of the imagination here, in all probability be the most evil person who has ever walked the face of the earth.
So he won't be part human and part demon the way it was depicted in the movie The Omen, where he was sired by a dog?
Unlikely.
Or mothered by a dog, I forget which it was. It was
Now,
a long time since I saw that movie.
Is there a possibility that Now, is there a possibility that he could be somehow, again, a hybrid like the Nephilim were? Bible doesn't address that at all, so I'm not going to say no, that couldn't take place. I mean, it might. But if it does, he definitely, again, is not going to be the devil himself. But make no mistake, the devil's going to be right there on his shoulder telling him what to do.
If the Antichrist is here already, would he know himself would that person know that I am going to be the...
I'm not even going to venture a guess on whether that would be true or not. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
Because the one thing the Bible does tell us, and we've already studied this part, is that whoever he is, he will not be revealed until we're gone. So at this point, all we can do is speculate who he is or whatever. We won't know until won't matter to us anymore. So does he know or will he know who he is? I don't know. I think the time certainly will come that he will know. But whether he knows at this point, I'm not going to venture a guess. Again, the Bible does not tell us. But is there a possibility that he is already alive and well on planet Earth? I think there's a very strong possibility of that. And I'm going to tell you something else about him here shortly that you're going to scratch your head about and just think, I don't know about that. But I'll get to that in a minute. Verse 40. At the end time. Now, let me before I read this, let me mention this. When we were studying earlier in the chapter, and it was describing Antiochus Epiphanes, it was talking about the king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the north was, in fact, Antiochus Epiphanes. You'll notice in this context, the king of the north is not the Antichrist. There's the king of the south, the king of the north, and the Antichrist is apparently a third leader. Because you can tell from the context, and that there are some commentators, I'm going to tell you right now, if you dig out your commentaries or read some other books about this, there are some that will say, well, the Antichrist is the king of the north. But as you read this, it doesn't take too much to realize that as Daniel is describing this, the king of the north and the Antichrist are two different people. From this respect, what Daniel is describing differs in the parallel with Antiochus Epiphanes. Another reason we know he is no longer talking about Antiochus, but has moved on to somebody else. And I'll point that out to you when we get to that. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he will enter countries to overflow them and pass through. Well, right there, the context would seem to indicate that the Antichrist is in the middle with armies coming at him from two different sides. Those that say, well, no, the Antichrist is the king of the north, that are saying that, well, what Daniel is saying is that the king of the north will storm against him. They're saying, well, the him is the king of the south. But as we continue on, I just don't see that being the case. I think what Daniel is describing here is the Antichrist is in the middle, and where's the middle going to be? Jerusalem. Better believe it. And he's going to have armies coming against him from the north, armies coming from the south. So even here, as great of a military leader as he will become, the Antichrist has still got rumblings, and there are still people who are going to oppose him. Verse 41, he will also enter the beautiful land. Now, you were asking me the other day about the reference to the beautiful land. Again, you can see here, Daniel refers to it, the beautiful land. He's talking about Israel. He will enter the beautiful land. Now, mine has the word countries in italics. As many countries will fall. But countries, that's an interpretation. Because in mine, countries is added. What the Hebrew just said is, and many will fall. I think all he's saying here is that there's going to be a lot of people going to get killed in this. A whole lot of people. And we do know that ultimately, by the time Christ comes, how many of the Jews are going to be left?
About a third.
Only a third. There you go. 2/3 of the Jews are going to die during all this. Now, I'm not adding them to our little running tally here because this isn't, I'm keeping a running tally of the world's population up here. But of the Jewish population, we know 2/3 of them are going to die. God is going to save a remnant, and that remnant's going to be a third.
But these will be rescued out of his hand. What's
Yep.
meant by that?
Well, let's go into that. It says, he will enter the beautiful land, many will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand. Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. What he's saying there, to answer your question, is that Daniel is saying that there's going to be these three, Edom, Moab, and the sons of Ammon, will escape the devastation and the wrath of the Antichrist. They're not going to be destroyed. Now, here's something that's worth actually addressing. We looked at this morning in our study of Isaiah. What's going to happen to, or I should say, what did happen to Moab?
It was destroyed.
Was destroyed. So the question is, why then does Daniel say that Edom, and by the way, what happened to Edom?
Destroyed.
Edom was destroyed. So why is Daniel saying Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon are going to be rescued when we know Edom and Moab are already gone? The answer to this lies in modern geography. I don't have a map. Maybe that's our next purchase as a church. We need to get some maps. But some of you got maps in the back of your Bible. If not, you're just going to have to kind of visualize this with me. What nation is across the Jordan River due east of Israel? Jordan. The modern country of Jordan. And by the way, anybody know what the capital of Jordan is?
Amman.
Amman. Wonder where that name came from.
Ammon.
Uh-huh. The Jordanians are the direct descendants of the Ammonites. And the land that did belong to Edom and did belong to Moab, guess where it is today? It's part of Jordan. So what Daniel is describing is not necessarily the people, because the Edomites and the Moabites are all dead. They've been dead for hundreds of years. But that whole area across the Jordan River from north to south, from Syria all the way south to the Arabian desert, is today the modern nation of Jordan, and it includes the land that used to belong to Moab, that would be on the north part of Jordan. In the middle would be where the Ammonites used to live, now the Jordanians. And to the south of that, in the southern portion of Jordan, is what used to be about 3,000 years ago, where the Edomites lived. So what he's saying is that while the Edomites and the Moabites as a people are gone, those who live there now, which are in fact the people of Ammon, they're going to be rescued. For whatever reason, God is going to allow the Jordanians to live through this. Now, I'm going to depart just a little bit from what the Bible is talking about here and just give you my personal interpretation. Have you noticed that while there's still a definite tension between the Jordanians and the Israelites, of all the various nations around Israel, have you noticed that the Jordanians, at least for the last several years, have tried to get along with the Israelites?
Yeah,
or
they've been
should say
the
now the
quietest.
Jews.
They've been the quietest of all the Arabs.
They have been the quietest of all of them. The Jordanians know, well, they've got enough common sense to realize that the Jews have the military power to pound them into the dirt. Jordan, while they're an Arab country, they're not a strong nation. They know Israel is way stronger than they are, and they're just across the river. So the Jordanians have kept their mouths shut for the last several years. And it very well could be that as other Arab nations come against Israel, the Jordanians are just like, hey, We are not going to attack Israel. We're staying out of this.
They intercepted some of the missiles that were headed for Israel.
And they did. And that one thing right there may be the very reason why when push comes to shove in all of this, that God allows them to live. That God spares the Jordanians because of their support for Israel. All right, about out of time here, so let me hurry up and at least finish this chapter. We may have to hold off on the rest of on chapter 12 for Wednesday. All right, verse 42. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. Well, no surprise there that the land of Egypt, that's where the king of the south is coming from. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. So what's going on here is the Egyptians apparently are going to be coming against the Antichrist. Libyans and the Ethiopians are going to get involved in it. But somewhere in the process, who's got the money? Who's got the oil? Antichrist is going to be in control of all this. Now, verse 44 is the interesting part. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him. Guess who's coming from the east?
China?
Now, Daniel does not go into detail about this. This is one of the reasons why I told you this whole thing is a big puzzle. You get a little bit from here and a little bit from here. Well, we know that the Bible also tells, not Daniel, this is one of those other things we're going to study probably back in Revelation. There's going to be rumors and wars, armies coming from the east. In the Bible, we've already studied this part, this army of, 600 million, I believe? Well, what nation in this world can today, if they had to, could field an army of 600 million men?
China.
And India. And they're east. Well, apparently, they're going either one of the two or both are going to be coming this way. And also, there's going to be a river that's going to dry up and allow them to cross over on dry land. Anybody remember which river that is?
Euphrates.
The Euphrates River. And the Antichrist, with his capital in Jerusalem, because he's going to take over and basically declare that he's God and that, that's now his capital. They're going to be coming at him, the Chinese, the Indians, or whoever, going to be coming at him from the east. He's going to hear of another army coming against him from the north. And by the way, if you take a map and you draw a line absolutely due north from Jerusalem, guess what it points to? Moscow. And I'm not exaggerating when I say you could take a ruler and just go straight north. It'll go right straight through Moscow. Rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Guess what that is a reference to, folks?
Armageddon.
The Battle of Armageddon. When he hears of these armies coming against him, he will gather together his army, and they're going to meet in this little place in northern Israel called the Plain of Megiddo. Verse 45, he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, which of course they're in Jerusalem. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. When it's all over and done with, the Antichrist loses. Now, Daniel, again, doesn't go into detail about this, but we know at that point, when they meet on the plain of Megiddo, that is when you will hear the trumpet sound. But not before absolutely hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions, will die on that plain. Now, we're going to pick up with chapter 12. These first 4 verses of chapter 12 will close out the story that we've been reading in chapter 11. So we're going to pick up with that, and then as we have time, we'll finish up the rest of chapter 12 on Wednesday. Questions this evening?